Hello once again. Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over some code and the tip calculator for the Murach's Android Programming 2nd edition by Joel Murach. And in the last couple chapters, I haven't gone through much code, and that will continue, fortunately or unfortunately, probably for most of chapters 8 and 9. Again, I'm not going to go over 10, 11, and 12, which are on the Newsreader app. I'll pick it back up on Chapter 13, which is the To-Do app. So Chapter 8 is on menus and preferences. All right. So one thing to realize is that you can have a menu if you want one, but you don't need to have one. All right. So if you look right here, we don't have a menu, at least not that we can see, but if we go here, you'll notice that we've got the 3 dots. Now, you'll typically have that, that's almost a throwback from something like Bootstrap or whatever, but you'll typically have something like that with especially with a smaller mobile device, because you don't have room on your screen to show things. The big thing I can tell you about menus is don't make them too ornate. In other words, this isn't bad. It's got settings and it's got about. You don't want 10 different options. You don't want 2 or 3 different menus. It's just too confusing to do it that way. Now, that's my opinion. You may or may not agree with that. You can put it at the top. It's even possible to put it at the bottom like you see right here. So there's a lot of ways that you can set this up. If you don't like text, you can set it up and you can put icons on the screen. If you're going to do that, make sure that the icons are indicative of the action that you want to have. What you'll see when we go over the to-do list later in chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16, I believe, is in the to-do list, if you want to add a new task, it's a plus sign. If you want to remove a task, you put it in the way, you click the wastebasket. Things like that that are intuitive to the user. That's what you want. All right. You can also combine and have both. So they talk about the 3 types of menus here. And these 3 types of menus, I'm trying to find it. They talk first about an option menu. And an option menu, as mentioned, typically drops down from the action overflow area. So it's kind of the one we've looked at. You can have a floating context menu. Again, some people find that when you've got things that float, they're a pain. Same thing with pop-ups. Most of the time when most people consider pop-ups, they consider right mouse clicking on their screen. And when they right mouse click, typically it brings up some kind of a pop-up. Now, a lot of people equate pop-ups with, for lack of better words, just being a pain in the butt. It's something that they don't like to have. It's not even considered a necessary evil. It's just considered an evil. So again, it just depends. But as I mentioned before, my recommendation to you is that you not go too nuts with this stuff. Even though you might think, wow, this is great, I put all this information in there, etc. If other people aren't going to use it, or if they feel that it's too cumbersome to use it, they won't. All right, and it may turn them off to even using your package, all right, your app. So figure 8.2, you see it on the screen, it'll be on the next couple slides here, talk about how to define a menu. What you do typically is under res menu, okay, that's where you will put whatever it is your menu is. So you add an XML file for the menu to the project's res menu directory. If you don't have one, you add the directory. In this example here, the menu is stored in an XML file with a name that's indicative of what you want it to do. It's the tip calculator menu. All right. The XML file for this begins with a root element named menu, and inside of there, you can specify one or more item elements that define the menu items. In the case that you see right here, there are 2 menu items, and each item defines 4 attributes. an ID, we're used to that by now, which is the name that you're going to use to access the item, possibly programmatically. The title attribute, which specifies the text for the item that's displayed in the menu. This text is going to be stored, it should be stored in your strings.xml file. The icon attribute, which specifies an icon for the item that's usually displayed in the action bar. All right, and then there's a show as action attribute, which specifies whether the item is shown in the action bar or not. So here's some of these attributes that you can use. The title, the icon, the show as action. All right, and notice what they have here when show as action. Always show it, never show it, and only show it if you've got room to show it. There's the location. Okay, we've talked about this before. There's where you would put your icons. As far as the code that displays the menu, this is on page 235 in the book. Again, you come in and you end up overriding the onCreateMenu method. Within this, you typically use what's called a menu inflator, and you can see that in the example right here. In fact, let's kind of blow this up a little bit. There we go. This converts or inflates the XML for the menu items into Java objects and stores them accordingly. Now, the onCreate options menu method must return a true value to display it on the screen, and that's why you see the true that's in there. As far as handling the particular items, there you go. What do you do? All right. Now, in this particular example here, notice we have toasts that are showing things on the screen. So we're using a switch statement to determine which menu item was selected. All right. Android only calls the onCreate options menu method the first time it displays this. To update the menu every time it's displayed, you can override a method named onPrepare options menu. All right. Now let's change gears a little bit here. They mention on page 236 that when an app contains more than one activity, so in other words, when it has more than one screen, that's what we're talking about here. So when it has more than one screen, menus are often used to navigate between them. You could use buttons as well, all right? To do that, you need to create what's called an intent. An intent, as you see on the screen right here, is an object that provides a description of an operation to be performed. So again, for instance, if you want to go from one screen to another. So the first example here shows two techniques for starting a new activity. All right, this first one that you see has two statements, where the first one creates the intent object, and then the second passes the intent object to the start activity. The second one that's there is the same thing, but it combines both of them into one line. All right. Again, it's going to run the second one's going to run a little bit faster because it's only a single line. But if you find the first one easier, especially when you're starting, that's the one you should use. All right. We'll take a look at this a little bit later. We will be going over that in class as well. Code that uses menu items to start new activities. Again, to start the new activity, you create the intent object and pass that object to the start activity menu, or method, I should say. So when an app contains more than one activity or screen, you often use menus to iterate between these two. Also make sure that this is a two-way operation. So in other words, let's say that you've got a beginning screen and an about screen and then an actual action screen. You might want to give the user maybe the beginning screen. You don't want to ever show that except for the beginning of the program. All right, so you automatically go to the about screen, let's say, And from the About screen, you go to your actual Action screen. But you want to probably at least give yourself a way to go back and forth between those two screens. So they're talking here, we could, for example, take rounding and put it on its own screen. Okay? All right. Preferences, which starts on page 238. They're also known as settings, and they provide a way for users to customize how an app works. Now, these are actually examples here of preferences. All right? Because if it says remember tip percent, you might end up showing something. If you say you want to do rounding, it's going to bring this up on the screen. If you don't want to do rounding, if you're the only one paying for the bill, you don't want that screen to show. So an app often allows the user to change preferences or settings for the app. Android provides a preferences API that lets you build an interface, all right, that's consistent with the user experience, so whatever you want them to be able to do. For most activities to do this, you use subclasses of the view class to build the user interface. In the example that we've used so far, the tip calculator activity uses the text view, the edit text, and the button classes to build the user interface. When you work with preferences, you use subclasses of the preference class to build the interface, and that's what they're showing right here. So you add an XML file to the res XML directory. The file typically is going to be named preferences.xml. You don't have to name it that, but it is by convention. The root element for the XML file is the preference screen element, which defines the screen with your preferences on it. Some of the attributes that apply to the preference elements include the key, which specifies the ID used across the preference, the title, which is the title of the preference, the summary, which summarizes the preference, the default value, if there is a default value. Some attributes that apply to the list preference element include dialog title, which specifies the title of a dialog box, entries, which specifies the names of the entries in the list, and entry values, which specifies the values. So some of this stuff, again, we've seen this kind of thing before, is kind of used as a key value type of pair. All right. In the early days of Android, it was common to display preferences directly within an activity, but this changed and it's been deprecated as of API 11, which is Android 3.0. So for most apps, you should use the technique that's described in figure 8.7, which is on page 243 in the book. You display preferences in a fragment. Now, we're going to talk about fragments more in the next chapter. In fact, it's the subject of the next chapter. But in a nutshell, a fragment is a class you can use to define part of a user interface. Fragments were introduced in Android 3.0, which was API 11, to provide more flexible user interfaces, especially to take advantage. There's a big difference in screen real estate, for example, between a tablet and a phone. So the first example that you see right here shows a fragment named settings fragment. All right. And that inherits the preference fragment class. Then here, the second example shows how to code a fragment for an activity. I'm not going to go into this. Again, I'm trying to cover this stuff more or less for completeness. But there's just, as always, there's way too much stuff to cover and give it the length and breadth of coverage that it deserves. So to work with preferences, all right, the first example that you see right here shows how to define the instance variables for the preferences. Then the second example or second step shows how to set the default values in the preference file. The third example or step shows how to get the shared preferences object. And the last example or step shows how to get the values from the preferences for the preferences from the shared preference object. Okay? As far as using preferences, once you get the preferences, you use them to change the way the app works. As mentioned, if you want to show something or not show something. So if I want to just, if I want to remember the tip, the big one here is rounding. All right. If I want to use rounding, if I basically choose that I want to do rounding, it's going to show things that are on the screen that otherwise wouldn't be shown. Now, one thing is what they've done here, if you look at this, is they've grouped the preferences. So remember tip preference and remember tip percent and default tip percent are under a category called tip percent, and rounding is under a category called rounding. All right. Occasionally you may want to disable something, and you can see it right there. If you want to do that, you can use a preferences dependency attribute which specifies the key of the preference that the current preference depends upon. You can also work with preferences right within Java code itself. So far in the chapter, what the author has done is to use the default behavior provided by the preference API. But sometimes you want to do more than that. So figure 812 on page 253 shows a Java class that basically examines how to work with preferences. Often this is useful if you want to override the default behavior. And that's pretty much it. So the chapter introduced you to menus and introduced you to preferences. We also got a little bit of stuff on fragments. And again, in the next chapter, we will be going over Chapter 9, which again, I'm not going to really go over much code, but we're going to talk about fragments in more depth and breadth of coverage. It's a little shorter chapter, so probably only take a few minutes to go over. Be back with that shortly.